tātou. Ko aku mihi ki te mana whenua ki te atiawa, me Ngāti Toa, me Ngai Tara. No horana te whenua tupu. Ko Jansje me Frans tōku mātua. Ko Mike Freeman o Kotane. Ko Yo roa ko Lindsay aku tamariki. E tipu ake o ki Amsterdam me ki Karori Pōniki. E noho ana au ki Paikakariki e Naene. Ko Maria Stubbe tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone. Thanks very much for being here to support me this evening. I'm delighted to have so many of my family, my friends and colleagues here this evening, both in person and online. I've had some lovely messages from people today who weren't able to be in person, so thank you for joining online. The title of my lecture tonight is Talk That Works. I chose this title because I've always been fascinated by the richness, the diversity and sophistication of how people use spoken language in different social contexts. And we don't have to go to school to learn how to do it. Most of us acquire these skills without conscious effort or full understanding of just how complex a communicative system we all use as humans. It's this hidden complexity that makes talk such a fruitful area for scientific study and for reflective practice. Being a linguist by training, I also like a good wordplay. The phrase talk that works has multiple meanings, more than two, William, that together nicely sum up key aspects of the academic and personal journey that has brought me here tonight. Most fundamentally, talk works in the sense that it's always doing something, and often more than one thing at once. Informing, persuading, empathising, agreeing or disagreeing, giving options, performing a particular kind of identity, agenda setting, and so on and so on. No matter how mundane an interaction might appear to be, if we look closely enough at a micro level, we can observe social actions being negotiated moment by moment in sequence as an interaction unfolds. Emanuel Shegloff, the co-founder of the field of conversation analysis, who just died last year, put it this way: conversation is sociological bedrock, the absolute foundation or base for everything humans do as social beings. He went on to say, conversational interaction may be thought of as a form of social organisation through which the work of most, if not all, the major institutions of societies, the economy, the polity, the family, socialisation, etc., get done. For humans, talking and interaction appears to be a primary constituent of social life. In other words, everyday conversational interactions and increasingly other kinds of interactions, such as social media, are building blocks for larger societal discourses and all the various communication practices and patterns that we learn to recognise. So this leads on to a second meaning. And this has really, I guess, been the focus of a lot of my work as well. How exactly does talk work? In other words, what are the patterns, the mechanics, the unspoken rules of spoken interaction? In other words, the means that people use to design their talk so that it will achieve a particular action or goal. Nobody communicates the same way all the time. Rather, we all have a rich communicative repertoire, a range of linguistic and other communicative or interactional resources from which we can select in different situations to achieve our interactional goals. John Heritage, who's actually stood here in this very lecture theatre about 15 years ago, a leading researcher into clinical interaction, recommends using the question, why that, here, now, when we're observing what people are saying. That doesn't just apply to academics, that can apply to practitioners. Using that question as an analytic lens to make sense of the choices that we observe people making in the moment about what they say, how they say it, and how they respond to what others say and do. To illustrate, let's take a quick look at this brief excerpt. It's less than a minute from the middle of a lengthy consultation between a primary care nurse and a newly diagnosed diabetes patient. This interaction was structured around a standardised checklist that was being used about 15 years ago, 12, 15 years ago, that the nurse has up on her computer screen. We join the conversation at the point where she needs to introduce a potentially sensitive topic, the patient's mental health. From the interactional strategies that the nurse chooses to use, we can see that she orients to this as a sensitive topic. She starts by framing her turn as providing information. While still looking at the computer, she says it, meaning diabetes, can affect lots of things. There are a few other areas which I'll just go through as well. Through choosing these neutral, non-specific words and grammar, she downplays the link between diabetes and depression, and then depersonalises it by using the passive voice. There has been a connection made. This demonstrates she is not making any assumptions, and perhaps that she's seeking to reassure the patient. She ends her utterance with a downward intonation, which is like a full stop in writing, which offers the patient an opportunity to respond. However, the patient simply nods slightly, which is a neutral response, which probably is intended to mean carry on, and that is exactly what the nurse does. But from the way the nurse designs her next turn, and also the fact that we know from looking at the video, which you can't see, but I have seen, we know that she's filling out a checklist on her computer screen. We can infer that she wasn't simply aiming to provide information, she was also seeking it. And we can also observe that she considers this to be a delicate matter through the way she's searching for words. It's not fluent. As she starts to ask the question, she uses the word mood, which is softer than depression. And she uses any and no, which together project a no problem answer is the appropriate one, or at least a possible one, which the patient duly gives. Mission accomplished. So, yes, it's very nerdy to spend so much time looking at a few lines of interaction. Thirdly, there is a practical or applied meaning that follows on logically from the first meaning, talk as action, and the second meaning, talk as design. In other words, what constitutes effective communication? Despite what you may see in many communication skills textbooks or pamphlets and training courses, this question is actually not very straightforward to answer. However, there are some fundamental principles from research in my disciplines of interaction or sociolinguistics and applied conversation analysis that can help. There's a useful analogy that was developed by Liz Stocco, a conversation analyst from the UK. She frames conversations as a racetrack that we have to navigate. Closer to home, in my household, playing football or playing music would be the metaphors of choice. Just as in conversations, there are predictable rules and patterns to follow, though these rules are not prescriptive and can be broken, as every referee knows. But each event is unique, and precisely how it unfolds is contingent on many different factors. Just as well, or we'd all get pretty bored, and I would have got pretty bored at looking at 500 plus health interactions over the last decade or two. As we saw in the excerpt that I just showed, interactions are usually rather more complex than we realise on the surface of it. And small details and the immediate local context are crucial. Finally, social and cultural factors are always in play, and all interactions involve negotiating relevant identities and relationships between oneself and the others with whom you're interacting. Of course, people don't generally attend consciously to the way they talk. It just goes by too fast, and certainly not at the level of detail that we looked at just before. And by definition, most ordinary talk is perishable. It's impossible to analyse it unless you can capture it and somehow rewind the recording. It's got a lot easier these days with Zoom. At least not usually. If you're a conversation analyst, you sometimes can't help yourself, much to the annoyance of your nearest and dearest. This raises the question, how can we take the growing body of evidence from applied interactional research out of the ivory tower to help practitioners optimise their communication by understanding what works well or not when people talk to one another in clinical and other organisational settings? How is the institutional business at hand, tasks or activities, routinely accomplished through talk? Where are the possible roadblocks and misunderstandings? Some of the learning approaches my colleagues and I have used over the years include using real-life interactional data or recordings and research findings to inform evidence-based reflective practice, action research, and role-play methods based on authentic data, such as Liz Stokoe's conversation analytic role-play method in mediation and dispute resolution, or Ruth Parry's real talk in palliative care. Importantly, we have found that these approaches work best when they are based on a strengths-based model, like appreciative inquiry, and on the issues that practitioners themselves identify and want to work on. Finally, talk itself is work in many cases. It's, for example, for me, a key tool of my trade as a university teacher and researcher, as it is for many other professionals. For example, many qualitative health researchers use scientific methods to ethically record, analyse and interpret people's stories as told in interviews, and also take note of how they choose to tell those stories. This provides us with unique insights into people's lived experience of health and healthcare and what they may know, think and do. Working with narratives has become increasingly relevant to my work as a health services researcher and evaluator over the last 15 years or so, in addition to a continuing focus on studying health interactions. Of course, an interview is a kind of interaction as well. Understanding the stories behind the statistics complements other kinds of health research that seek to address gnarly, wicked problems such as health inequities, vaccine hesitancy, and the current epidemic of diabetes. A key part of the brief for an inaugural professorial lecture, henceforth IPL, is to share some of my own story, in particular the experiences that helped shape my academic career. I'll also try to give you a taste of how various aspects of my own work and that of the teams I'm part of were woven together as I crossed between different disciplines, topics and settings over the years. I'll start with some early life history, which was and has remained an important influence. My parents grew up in the working class Jordaan area of inner Amsterdam, within sight of the Westerkerk near the Anne Frank House. They were primary school aged children during the World War II occupation. Times were tough. Their educations were disrupted. They had to survive the hunger winter until Amsterdam was liberated by US troops in May 1945. This history, family history, sort of makes what's currently happening in Europe in the news particularly poignant, for me at least. In the photo on the right, your right, taken around 1950, my mother is centre front with two cousins and a friend of the family. Her father, my opa Colt, is second from the left. My oma is in a white dress, and Mum's opu, my great-grandmother, second from the right. Plus there are two great-aunts in the photo as well, and the third one may be the one taking the photo. We tried to figure it out. On the left is the street where we all lived until I was 4 years old. My father, as you can see by the uniform in my parents' wedding photo, was away on compulsory military service for 2 years. Remember, we're talking fairly immediately post-war. So there's the obligatory IPL baby photo. So been there, done that. And then in the other photo, actually the building on your left is at the corner of the street where we live, the Lendengracht. Gracht is the Dutch word for canal, but in fact there is no canal there anymore. It's been filled in, and it's now the place where there is a regular market. The other photo on the other side is of my parents, myself, and my brother Frank, who can't be here tonight. He's currently enduring a power cut in Spain, I believe. So my aunt and uncle on my father's side had already migrated and they had come to New Zealand, and my father was pretty keen to improve our family's lot by also migrating. He didn't necessarily think it had to be New Zealand. He applied to Canada, the US and Australia, but in the end New Zealand got the vote. It was an assisted passage, and I believe we were supposed to go to Christchurch, but my uncle and aunt lived in Wellington and they'd found us accommodation in Lower Hutt to start off, so that's where we ended up. We sailed to Wellington on a ship called the Seven Seas via the Suez Canal and Fremantle, and I think I remember staying at someone's house in a little sleep out in Fremantle. I'm not sure if it's a real memory or a manufactured one. So we quite quickly moved from the hut to a house in Karori where I had spent my primary school years. Every so often I'm going to make a little pop-up connection, and my pop-up connection here is that one of my childhood friends from that time popped up many years later as a University of Otago Wellington colleague. Where are you, June? I can't actually remember learning English or not being able to speak it. I somehow just magically acquired it, and by the time I got to school. I do remember that we spoke Dutch at home and English everywhere else, and I used to think that was how it was for everyone. So this is one of my earliest memories, is coming home from, not from school, but a play date. Well, we didn't call them play dates in those days, but going to play at a school friend's house, and my mother asking me, what was it like? Did I enjoy myself? And I said, yeah, it was good, but it's really strange because she has to speak English to her mother at home. This was my first lesson in sociolinguistics. I always felt discouraged from speaking Dutch outside the home as a child, and I don't know to what extent it was because my parents, particularly our father, wanted us to fit in as fast as possible, or whether it was actually that 1960s New Zealand was not somewhere that was very conscious of diversity. And the Dutch were sometimes called the invisible immigrants because it was possible to fit in by at least your children learning to sound like a Kiwi pretty soon. So Britain was called home when I was at school. We sang God Save the British Queen because we actually had a perfectly good Dutch Queen. But at pictures, I joined brownies and then guides, and where we lived, it was mainly a Pākehā world. But Mum also taught me to read and write in Dutch with an alphabet board. Gone too far. An alphabet board like the one above, which has the vowel sounds that you say in Dutch. And I remain fluent. Well, it might be a matter of opinion for some of my Dutch relatives, and I am to this day, which is a real blessing. I get very annoyed when person after person says, gosh, it's amazing that you still speak such good Dutch. Sounds a bit patronising. But anyway, I can get by. It's also annoying when I ask somebody the directions in a town that I don't know and they address me in English because they have an English accent when I speak Dutch. So there you are. So it was important for us and our family to speak Dutch at home because it was the way we kept in touch with our relatives in Holland. And I call it Holland because the part of the Netherlands where we lived is the province of Holland, Amsterdam. We were infrequent and very expensive long-distance calls. So you can see me on the landline. I don't know if it was a real call or whether it was there for the sake of the camera. We had several visits from them. They came by ship until I was an adult, actually. We also spoke Dutch and made reel-to-reel tape recordings. And we received food parcels with Dutch treats, and they went back with the reel-to-reel tapes back and forth between Amsterdam and Wellington. So none of them have been saved. because they were recorded over and over and over. And let's not forget those flimsy blue aerograms. When I was old enough, I had to write on those. My first experience as a 5 and 6-year-old was of the New Zealand health system remains imprinted in my memory. I spent several months in the children's ward at Wellington Hospital, where the Royal Dalton tiles and rocking horse are still on display. And I really remember that rocking horse because I was terrified of the sister of the ward. And once I came out of traction, I was told by one of the nurses that I too could go and have a go on the rocking horse, but I didn't dare because I had to go past the sister's office. So I never got to sit on the rocking horse. Our family in those years grew from 2 to 5 kids. And as the eldest, I helped look after the kleintjes, the 3 little ones. Mum had 3 under 5 at one point. And so I'm told, I spent the rest of my time reading every last children's book in the Crawley Library until they ran out when I turned about 9. So those were my primary school years. And just before my last year of primary school, my parents told us, it seemed a little bit out of the blue to us, that we were going back to Amsterdam. I did not want to go back. Apparently, I was a real nightmare from the moment I was told. Anyway, back we went by ship through the Panama Canal this time, and I experienced some real culture shock as a 13-year-old. Inner city living in Amsterdam, it was really cold and dark in the winter. And there was a rather different perspective on the same history that I'd learnt in New Zealand. It was the other side. And I was really homesick for all my friends. It was also here that I remember learning my 2nd and 3rd lessons in sociolinguistics. Languages change. Things like spelling reform, which the Dutch were very, very keen on. Slang and colloquialisms change, vocabulary changes. Actually, there was a lot of vocabulary I simply didn't know because I hadn't been to school, in a Dutch school. And the other kids would say, "Wat praat je toch daar?" because I had an English accent. They thought I was a bit weird. There were some positives: colour TV, lots of extended family, cousins and aunts and uncles, all the yummy Dutch treats that you could persuade your mother to buy for you. And I finally learnt to ride a bike. I had a friend, Nellie, who was appalled that at the advanced age of nearly 13 I did not know how to ride a bike, and she made it her business to take me out every day after school until I mastered it. After a year, because it wasn't that easy to find accommodation in Amsterdam with 5 children in the middle of a housing crisis, and because my mother and I were really keen to come back to Wellington, we came back. Well, that's the family story anyway. This time we flew, and not long after I started at Wellington Girls College, and life sort of carried on from there. As teenagers and as children, in fact, we were always encouraged to interact with adults, to question, to express opinions. But this, and generally Dutch forthrightness, didn't always go down well with Kiwis, especially secondary school teachers. So I did have the secret shame of a few detentions as a result. Secondary school, Wellington Girls College, was also where I took up music. I started learning to play the violin with the scary Mrs. Tania Diet. I was not popular with her, and I was not popular with my family. So I very quickly dropped the violin and borrowed a friend's guitar, and I was told if I wanted to have guitar lessons, I'd have to get a job. My parents had their own business. So that was fine. I did that. I got a guitar. I joined the choir, and this was the start of my life as a poozler. In case you're wondering what that means, it's a word from the New Zealand English Dictionary, which means a collector or a scavenger. At this time, if I wanted copies of songs written down, because I was never that good at learning things by ear, I had to go to the library, get out the book full of songs, get a refill pad with music staves on it and copy everything by hand. I've still actually got some of those songs. Somewhere. Mike's hidden them in the cupboard under the stairs, I think. So the other thing that happened during my secondary school years, partly thanks to a very patriotic French teacher, was that I developed a very strong sense of social justice, starting with the Mururoa atoll protests against the dropping of the test bombs in the grounds of Parliament, in which I instigated a mass walkout from our French class, hence one of the detentions. I also became a volunteer adult literacy tutor at some point during my secondary school years. And as I said before, I had to have a job, so I learned to do bookkeeping in the family business. And as Christine Groves knows, this has turned out to be very useful in my later life as a researcher, because I can actually create CCWs and understand the monthly finance reports. Well, sort of. Okay. I was the first in the family to go to university. Well, as my brothers would say, yeah, I was the eldest, as they never fail to point out how old I am compared to them. I studied a BA, eventually getting a BA honours, and I double majored in education and linguistics, and that was partly because you couldn't start doing linguistics until your second year. I also studied CAF 101, multiple university student protests, went flatting in my second year, and discovered folk music. Because I knew that I wanted to be a teacher, there weren't really too many other options presented to us in, 1970s, by the time I was at college. I applied for a teaching studentship and received the princely sum of $60 per fortnight, and the rent in my flat was $12 a week. So I didn't need to work, and because I didn't need to work, I continued volunteering in adult literacy, and I started also volunteering on Sunday mornings at Spelled, which was a remedial reading volunteer organisation, which was a great teaching apprenticeship. This period was also when I first started doing research involving recording real-life talk. Danny, you probably don't remember this, but when you were a little bloke, I recorded you and wrote notes about how you were acquiring an interesting mix of English and Dutch grammar and vocabulary. So it was, you were a real-life language guinea pig. And not content with that, in my honours year, I did a project looking at gender differences in language use in recordings of my ex-flatmate's dinner table talk. Influenced by previously mentioned Emmanuel Shegloff and his colleague Saxon Jefferson, who'd written a seminal paper on turn-taking in talk, which was really the first conversation analytic paper, which I found absolutely fascinating. So another pop-up connection to UIW from this time was Professor Graham Kennedy, who lectured me in transformational grammar and language acquisition, and later became the director of the English Language Institute, actually after I left there. But he is the father of John Kennedy, who's now my colleague in the Department of Primary Healthcare and General Practice. So another nice little connection. He was tough. He was a tough lecturer. It was hard, actually harder than getting promoted to professor, to get an A from Professor Kennedy. At the start of my honours year, I was actually still a baby, Mike and I married. I was 21. I think you might have been 22. Later that year, I was appointed to a 3-year position as a junior lecturer at the English Language Institute, teaching on the Diploma of Teaching English as a Second Language program and English proficiency courses. And this really helped me gain much more of an international perspective on life. I also had the opportunity to sit on the Home Tutors Association Advisory Board, which they supported new migrants. And in my final year at the ELI, the 1981 tour protests became a regular weekend activity, and my motorbike helmet got a lot of extra use. My first academic article, which you see up there, with ELI colleague Joanne McComish was published in 1983, shortly after I completed my year of teacher training, which I eventually did have to do because I'd been receiving a studentship all the way through my degree. Somehow, I had managed to turn a reading exercise into an interactional activity. 1981 was the end of my academic career for a while. It was followed by 6 years of school teaching, in at the deep end, teaching adolescents at Taita Intermediate. I wanted to teach new entrants. They said, no, you're a graduate, you can teach intermediate. I was also conned into becoming the girls' soccer coach. I'd never played soccer in my life. After 2 years teaching in the hut, 3 for Mike, we embarked on a 2-year OE in Southeast Asia and Europe, and we eventually ended up living and teaching in North London for almost 18 months. The photo at the bottom there is of Wood Green in London, which is the area where I taught. And on returning home, I taught for a year at Kelvin School before our first child, Yoel, was born. In that class, we had an Apple IIe to share between 2 Form 1 and 2 classes. 1 computer between 60 kids and 2 teachers. Yes, I know, I'm out of the ark. And I had to get 2 11-year-old boys in my class who were budding IT whizzes to show me how to use it. So another pop-up connection from my time as a teacher. I recently met TJ, a nurse researcher at Kokiri Haura, who has just started working with the Arch Group on our new Catalyst Grant project. Turns out she is the much younger sister of one of my first pupils at Taita Intermediate. Isn't it amazing? Isn't Wellington amazing in that way? It's not even 2 degrees of separation. Some super busy years followed. I had my first baby, and as you do, I decided to return to academia at Victoria University to do a master's thesis. After I did that thesis, my second baby was born, and soon to be followed by a revolving portfolio of part-time research and teaching, as well as many school and family activities, plus committees. Parent Centre, Community Childcare, Babysitting Bank, Linguistic Society, Treasurer, because remember I learnt bookkeeping. All credit to my mum for so willingly filling the frequent gaps in my childcare arrangements. Okay, pop-up connection number, I've lost count, 3, I think, Eileen McKinley. This is when we first met, because both our eldest children both attended the Victoria University Student Creation Fairley Terrace while we were both doing our masters. And I'm sure she was equally busy juggling everything. And looking back, wasn't it nuts? So at top left is my second published article, which was based on my MA thesis. And it's interesting to look back at how methodologies have changed and how my approach to methodologies have changed as well. So in 1994, though, having done my master's thesis and discovered the complexities of all the little bits of spoken language that a couple of decades worth of much more clever researchers than me had been spending looking at things like gender differences in the way people use language and counting the number of interruptions and the number of times people said supportive things like mm-hmm. And I followed that pattern and did that with classroom interaction. But in the course of doing that, I realised they were counting apples and pears a lot of the time. So I wrote this article that said that this was really a flawed way of approaching the problem because they weren't considering what these things actually did in their local context. And I also said that combining qualitative with quantitative methods was in fact the way to go. And I find myself still frequently having to make that case even now in the context of health sciences research and evaluation. So here is the technology that I used to record the classroom interaction data from my masters. Old school cassette tapes, and they have survived. And my good friend and colleague Rachel has just brought me a ghetto blaster so I can play them again. whereas CD-ROMs and all of those things have died long since. So old school cassette tapes, no digital sound files, completely manual transcription with tapes that would stretch as you kept rewinding them. On the right is a computer quite similar to the Commodore 3C that I bought to write up my thesis. It had a floppy drive, an amber screen, a hard drive the size of a modern CD-ROM, so maybe, I think Darryl said about 750 megabytes. No built-in macros, so I had to use BASIC. No mouse, even. I had to use function keys, and I had a dot matrix printer, which was pretty radical at the time. Oh, and no internet, of course. So, how did I do my literature search, you may well ask? I had to spend days and evenings and my weekends and my spare time going through card file catalogues for books and journals that were held on site in the library and read through hard copy books of abstracts in the library basement with a very tiny budget to import on paper interloan copies, which would arrive by surface mail 6 months later. My literature review was not very large, and it was probably 2 or 3 years out of date. But that was okay in those days because everyone was in the same boat. If the library did hold the journal, then I had to photocopy it, as they were usually on closed reserve, and it was expensive. So in the years after completing my master's, I worked on several projects researching New Zealand English discourse. My job at Victoria University was permanently temporary to varying degrees of part-time for 13 years, right through to when I left in 2003, as is still the case for most soft-funded researchers all around New Zealand today. I filled the gaps with consultancy and fixed-term university teaching gigs. So very far from your typical 40 teaching, 40% research, 20% service academic job. But I certainly learned a lot, and there was plenty of variety. And the best of all was if I didn't want to do it, I could say no. So, one highlight, as William said from this time, was helping to compile the 1,000,000-word Wellington corpus of spoken New Zealand English. That seemed like an awful lot then. It seems like nothing now in the days of large language models. But it was a pretty impressive achievement at the time. And Bernadette, are you here? Yeah. So Bernadette continues to manage the corpus, the Wellington corpus of spoken New Zealand English and written New Zealand English. So Bernadette and I have worked together for, I've lost count, a very long time. Okay, so I spent hours hanging out at Irarangi o Te Upoko o Te Ika, the radio station, who kindly allowed me to sample their radio interview archive for inclusion in the corpus. But we were finding it hard to collect enough informal conversations to meet our target. From memory, I think we had to get 3/4 of the target had to be informal interaction. So I had the bright idea of turning this into a mini research project for our third-year sociolinguistics students, and it was a very successful strategy, though there were the occasional hiccups. One day, towards the end of the semester, I was rung by a very upset parent, demanding to know why we were requiring them to agree to being recorded or their daughter would fail the course. So I determined that our research ethics training on informed consent had fallen a bit short. Another highlight was having the opportunity as, well, perhaps not that young, but as a new researcher, to devise my own sociolinguistic New Zealand English discourse studies using data from the corpus. I was lucky enough to be able to work with an IT whiz who scripted a bespoke word search program called Phrase for me. Both of these studies are still being cited regularly, but I myself have long since moved on from this kind of variationist sociolinguistic research, which treats social characteristics as some kind of independent variable, and that's not really how I see the world these days. Now, as I noted earlier, traditional approaches to organisational communication training are often not based on what actually happens in real-life interactions. Janet Holmes and I identified a need to develop evidence-based communication advice and training resources, and government funding to do this work initially continued for 7 years, and I think this would be vanishingly unlikely to happen in today's research environment, especially if you're doing humanities-style research or social science research. The findings were written up in a book. Not too far. Back here. First published in 2003, and then we were asked to do a second edition in 2015. And the team also produced and continues to produce a large number of other publications. I left Victoria University in 2003 when that initial 7 years of funding ended, and there was a gap for a year or two, but the Language in the Workplace project has kept on going strong since and gone into lots of fresh fields. A major component of that program was a study that I set up and led at the Unilever factory in Petone. A particular team at this plant was invited by management to be part of the research because they were very successful on a number of objective measures like productivity, lack of outages and so forth, but their team culture and communication style was really unorthodox by company standards. For example, in their own words, they often played silly buggers. Practical jokes, jocular abuse and swearing were common. They made tremendous use of humour as a way of oiling the wheels of what probably wasn't the most exciting work. So this study was very much a team effort, like pretty much all the research I've ever done, with particular contributions from Megan Ingle, who you can see in the white lab coat, who undertook much of the field work, and Bernadette Vine and Louise Burns, who managed the very large amount of data that we collected. And one of the tangible outcomes from that project was the multimedia resource that you can see at the cover off here, which also included interviews and video clips from the Auckland shoe factory, collected by another colleague, Pascal Brown. Note, the technology had changed again. By this time, we were now using Sony mini discs. They weren't really that great. They were pretty annoying. Okay, an important output for me from my time with the Language in the Workplace project was my PhD, which focused on miscommunication. Why? Because sometimes understanding what goes wrong can help us figure out what goes right and how that can be replicated. I eventually completed my thesis a few years after I'd moved across to Otago. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Derek Wallace, who was my supervisor at that point, for really going the extra mile and making sure I got there in the end. So the longitudinal tracking methodology and theoretical framework for analysing miscommunication that I developed during my Language in the Workplace and PhD research also inspired aspects of the design for a Marsden-funded Arch Group project that I co-led with Kevin Dew here. In this case, with a focus on where the communication pitfalls might occur in the course of a patient journey through their episode of care, from primary care through to hospital and back. So I'm going to skip this example because I'm going to run out of time. So now on to my second big migration from linguistics and social sciences to health sciences and primary health care and general practice. So this slide lists the three big externally funded projects that became the basis for the Arch group that William mentioned and for the Arch corpus of health interactions that we collected. Because remember, I'm a poozler. I like collecting stuff. So I started at URW when the interaction study commenced in September 2003 with funding from the Health Research Council. And it built on earlier research that had been done on elective services and pathways to surgery. Data from these projects has been analysed using a whole range of qualitative techniques, including discourse and conversation analysis. And the insights gained have informed the training of health practitioners and the development of guidelines and educational resources over a number of years. But it was really a matter of chance that I ended up coming at all, but certainly staying at the medical school, as everyone referred to the Otago Wellington campus back then. So it started with a phone call from Kevin Dew, who I had known from when he was at Victoria University, and he said, "I don't suppose you'd have a spare half a day a week, would you?" I said, "Okay, why?" And he said, "Well, we just got this funding, and we were supposed to be recording health interactions, and we didn't really think we'd get the funding, and we don't really know how to do it." So in the end, I didn't do it because we recruited the wonderful Lindsay MacDonald. Where are you, Lindsay? Who I had also met, another one of these pop-up coincidences, had done a master's in nursing at Victoria University looking at small talk in district nurse conversations out in the field, if I've summarised that correctly. So I knew that when Deb McLeod and Kevin said, oh, we've got this person coming called Lindsay McDonald who wants to join the project. I said, you don't need to interview her. Just appoint her. I think they did interview her. But yeah, so Lindsay did a lot of this collection because having had the experience of setting up large corpora, it seemed like a no-brainer to create a corpus of health interactions. It was such hard work collecting this data, collecting these recordings. Why would you chuck them out after 5 or 10 years? So that was the starting point. And then, of course, we needed a brand. And in those days, we were still allowed to create our own logos, so we did. And the Arch Group was born, quickly followed by a successful bid for a Marsden grant. So that settled it. So here's a little bit of information about the Arch Group and how it evolved. I very quickly learned to value working in multidisciplinary research teams and to appreciate the way that interdisciplinary teamwork is just the way we do things around here. I came here feeling like a bit of an imposter, actually, mainly because of my linguistics colleagues who said things helpfully like, why on earth are you going to work in a medical school? What can you do there? And none of my clinical colleagues ever asked me that question, to their credit. And they also gave me the opportunity to maintain my own disciplinary roots as an interactional sociolinguist. So we had me as a sociolinguist, we had Kevin as a medical sociologist, we had a nurse researcher, and we had Tony Dow, and we had Libby Plumbridge at that time in our team, who'd come up from Christchurch. So here are two of the articles that came out of that first interaction study. So I won't go into those. If you're interested, you may read them yourself. One of them was in the New Zealand Family Practice, which has since morphed into the Journal of Primary Health Care. And this article is an overview of the diabetes tracking study, which came next, where we recorded, again, longitudinal research. We recorded all the interactions of 32 patients in Wellington and Auckland with newly diagnosed type 2 diabetes as they moved through the primary healthcare system for 6 months. And we analysed those journeys using a combination of observational and ethnographic data and interaction analysis. The health professionals perceived that they didn't have enough time with the patients, but we were able to demonstrate that wasn't really the case. The problem lay in a lack of knowledge about exactly what other disciplines contributed to patient care. I wasn't exclusively involved in pure Arch Group research as it was positioned then, which was mainly interactional research. By 2008, I'd been appointed to a permanent half-time, which was quite normal in our department, a half-time academic role as a senior lecturer. And it was the first time in my life I'd had any kind of permanent job. Although in those days you still had a 5-year confirmation period, so maybe it didn't quite qualify. My letter of appointment also stated that I still held 2 part-time fixed-term senior research fellow positions, which had expiry dates, just to be really clear. And part of my role was to facilitate research development across the department and to undertake teaching. And the 2 people to the left of me on the photo are Helen Moriarty, who convened the addiction medicine program at that time, and Rachel Tester from the Arch Group. And between us, we did several projects on this topic. And this one was an online educational resource, mostly created by Rachel, which was based on our first project of lived experience research. Jo Hilda and I also supported Ben Gray to launch some research on the use of interpreters, beginning with the summer student project. And this has turned into a wonderful ongoing collaboration over the past 15 years or more, resulting in production of some really well-received practitioner resources. And icing on the cake, we were runners-up in the 2021 Primary Care Awards for this body of work. Once I had my own PhD under my belt, I was allowed to start supervising other PhD students. And here are the PhD students that I have supervised. What a superb bunch they were to work with, and still are. We've covered the whole gamut from communication and surgical interactions to sign language to vaccine hesitancy and critical discourse analysis to variations in sexual development, to cyberbullying and metaphors. Who would have thought that one of my PhD students would be doing a more linguistics-focused PhD than me? So, fast forward, in 2018, I got involved for the first time in large-scale evaluation research, and William's already mentioned that. I'm not sure if you mentioned the first study I'm thinking of. I was just an associate investigator in a very large nationwide team looking at evidence to guide investment in, note the singular, a model of primary care for all, and was tasked with some of the qualitative field work. And that was fine, although it was interrupted by COVID. The second evaluation was quite exciting, both in terms of its innovative methodology and because of the services that were being developed to help young people, which was sorely needed. So integrated therapies for 18 to 25-year-olds suffering mild to moderate mental distress. I don't know why academic project titles always have to be so long. Yet another COVID-disrupted project was a co-designed national survey of young people that followed on after the Picky project. We did it as a follow-up to findings from our evaluation that many young people were actually ambivalent about receiving mental health services online or remotely and preferred at least some in-person support as part of the mix. So we wanted to find out if that was reflected at a more national level. And we had a wonderful group of participants, service user, young people participants who helped with that project and were actually part of the research team and whose name appear on the publication that came out from it. But not to be deterred by a mere virus, even though it had already interrupted several of our projects, members of the Arch Group and other department members teamed up with researchers from the National Institute of Health Innovation at Auckland University to undertake a formative evaluation of IMAC, the Immunisation Advisory Centre's training program for COVID-19 vaccinators, as it was being rolled out. This meant that we were able to provide constructive feedback based on our interviews and observations, surveys, training statistics and so on in real time as the rollout proceeded. So it was pretty interesting. And most of the work had to be done remotely, of course, for obvious reasons. During this evaluation, we had observed many innovative models for delivering COVID vaccination, especially by Māori and Pacific providers, and by some other groups who face barriers to access. And we were curious to find out what community members thought about these strategies and whether they had continued to be used after the pandemic, for example, to help reduce the really concerning drop in childhood immunisation rates amongst Māori and Pacific whānau especially. We received funding from the HRC and from Otago University to partner with 7 of the providers that we had worked with during the COVID-19 evaluation to document the lessons that could be learned from their experiences. And we hadn't heard the title of the Royal Commission of Inquiry at that time. We've written up a case study report and have just submitted it to the second round of the Royal Commission of Inquiry. These photos show a similar initiative in my own village of Paikakariki towards the end of 2021 when a rainbow clinic was run in our local hall. It was well supported. Over the past 2 years, several members of the team that worked on the COVID vaccination evaluation have had the opportunity to be involved in several different community studies looking at winter preparedness and people's use of non-pharmaceutical, so not vaccines and antiviral medication, but public health measures to avoid getting seriously ill from influenza. Things like wearing masks, staying home from work or school, using multiviral rat tests and so on. And this involved listening really closely to people's stories and how they themselves wanted to go about protecting vulnerable members of their households and communities in ways that were manageable for them in the context of their own lives, rather than having one-size-fits-all strategies imposed on them from above. These studies were funded by the same funder that's now funding a big new program of work led by Nikki Turner at Auckland University. And Flu Lab is a philanthropic trust, so we keeping our fingers crossed that we'll be able to continue the work. And the Arch Group are leading the qualitative arm of this project. This will include a national extension of the previous interview studies that we worked on, as well as direct observation of health interaction. So we'll be adding to the Arch corpus once again. We have already identified around 100 existing pre-COVID respiratory consultations in the Arch corpus that we'll be analysing before we start the new work. So we perform a comparative data set. So once again, we've now got data that was, so first data was collected in 2004, so it's now over 20 years old. So we're starting to do historical comparisons, which is quite nice. And this is our second new and exciting piece of work, which aims to bring together academic, community and clinical stakeholders in New Zealand and internationally to create a local health experiences research network and a public website in New Zealand that will be loosely modelled on similar successful initiatives in the UK, much, much bigger than what we'll be able to do, but also Australia and 12 other countries, some of which are a similar size and scale to Aotearoa. There isn't much to report as yet, but watch this space. I'd just like to finish now with a few short reflections. First of all, preparing this lecture has really highlighted for me just how much change I've experienced in the course of my career, not just professionally, but in terms of just daily life. There have also been some really big changes in my own thinking, again, in terms of theory and methodology, but also starting from that early exposure to orienting to England and living in a Pākehā society to getting to the point where last year I was writing a grant application, and as you do, I looked at a similar one that I'd written 3 or 4 or 5 years earlier, and I thought, my God, did I really write that? Because it just didn't fit the way that we want to focus on things like equity and diversity now. At least a lot of us still do. So audiovisual and IT technology has advanced light years, and now AI is making its presence felt. But I think it's more important than ever to keep focusing on human perspectives and experiences in this new age of big data and algorithms. This also means really keeping our eye on the ball to support equity and diversity, because they can be washed out in big data very easily. Some things, sadly, don't seem to change. I spent a lot of my time in the 1990s giving talks and lectures about how to overcome sexist language, or how to write with non-sexist language. And here we are again. We're not allowed to say pregnant people. So, yeah, not that we're getting back to this sort of, hopefully temporarily, to this era of non-inclusive language. So, sadly, some things don't seem to change. Or maybe it seems as if they might have, and then they revert back. But I'm an optimist by nature, and I'm hopeful that things will turn back in our favour sooner rather than later. And in the meantime, we will just have to keep on keeping on. So thanks again to all the family, friends, colleagues who've made time to come along this evening. It's been really wonderful to have you here. I don't know that I've ever been able to talk for however long I've talked without being interrupted by some of you. I'd also, particularly Mike, I'm looking at you. I'd also like to acknowledge all the amazing people I've had the privilege of working with over the years in research and teaching teams, my departmental colleagues, my students, and others at the Wellington campus, including our magnificent professional staff who make our academic tasks possible. And a special mention has to go to our research advisors. I have actually lost count of how many grant applications you collectively have helped with. And I'd like to close now with this whakatauki. E hera takutoa I te toa takitahi, engari ke he toa takitini. My success should not be bestowed onto me alone. It was not individual success, but the success of a collective. Thank you, everyone.